Have you ever walked into a sunlit kitchen on a quiet morning and felt even for a moment that you belonged utterly and completely? My name is Madison Taylor, and if you've ever found comfort in the small rituals of family or wondered how those early moments shape the woman you become, maybe you'll find a piece of yourself here too. Before Monterey, before the legal battles and heartbreak, before I learned how strong I truly was, I was just a little girl, growing up in a house full of the smell of old books and cinnamon bread. My mother Linda was strict but loving. She believed in earning your own sunrise, as she'd say over breakfast. My father Paul was quieter, but always there to steady my hand as I tried and failed and tried again. It was a home built on routine encouragement and a sense that no storm lasted forever. Looking back, I realized the lessons started long before I ever knew their value. I remember rainy afternoons spent at the kitchen table, my father humming along to old records, my mother teaching me the difference between settling and striving. There was a gentle pride in our home, the kind that doesn't shout but lingers in the way someone smooths your hair or leaves the porch light on a little longer than needed. My childhood wasn't grand, but it was full of scraped-knees library cards and the unspoken promise that I could become anything as long as I worked for it. I learned that family could be a safe harbor and also a mirror showing you not just who you are, but who you might one day become. Those lessons carried me through the hardest times when I felt invisible at school or doubted whether I'd ever be more than just the quiet girl from Pacific Grove. But every setback seemed softer after a talk with Mom or a walk with Dad through the foggy hills behind our house. They reminded me that real strength isn't about never falling, but about getting up again with kindness in your heart. Sometimes when the world felt cold, I'd picture that kitchen and its golden morning light, proof that even in small places, big dreams can take root. I didn't know it then, but the foundation they gave me would be the anchor I'd cling to when everything else threatened to wash away. Now, as I tell you my story, I invite you to remember your own beginnings, the people who taught you to believe in something better, even when life got messy. Before betrayal and courage, before courtrooms and fresh starts, there was a little girl learning to stand tall no matter the weather. That's where this journey begins, not with a broken heart, but with the quiet hope that home in all its imperfect ways can shape the strongest parts of us. And maybe the storms we face later are easier to survive because someone once taught us how to find the sun even on the rainiest day. Have you ever noticed how certain smells or sounds can carry you straight back to a different time? For me, it's always the scent of cinnamon or the low hum of an old jazz record. If I close my eyes, I can almost hear my mother bustling around our narrow kitchen, her footsteps soft on the faded linoleum, her laughter floating over the radio. My childhood in Pacific Grove wasn't extraordinary by anyone else's standards, but to me, it was everything: a patchwork of warmth, quiet encouragement, and everyday acts of love that stitched me together in ways I didn't understand until much later. My mother Linda ran our home with the kind of steady confidence that made you believe even the worst days could be survived. She was strict, yes, but her rules always came with reasons. Never just because I said so. She'd explain, if you want the sunrise, Maddie, you have to be willing to wake up in the dark. I used to grumble at having to help with chores or set the table when my friends were outside playing, but now I see those moments for what they were: early lessons in effort, consistency, and respect for yourself and those you love. Dad was the opposite of Mom in almost every way: gentle where she was determined, patient where she was quick to act. He worked as a librarian at the local branch, and sometimes he'd bring home battered old books for us to read together. Those evenings, with the two of us curled up under a blanket, he'd say, "Every story teaches you something, even the ones that hurt." I think I absorbed more about resilience and empathy from those tattered pages than I ever did from school. When I was bullied in 3rd grade for wearing the same hand-me-down coat, Dad was the one who held me as I cried, and then helped me come up with clever comebacks, gentle but never mean. We didn't have much, but we made the most of it. On weekends, Mom would make bread from scratch, letting me knead the dough with my small, sticky hands, both of us laughing when flour went everywhere. If there was leftover dough, we'd sprinkle it with cinnamon and sugar, a tiny luxury that felt like pure celebration. It's not about having more, Mom would say, handing me a warm golden roll. It's about making what you have count. I carried that with me through lean years' disappointments, and even the first flush of success much later in life. Sometimes I wonder if my determination to build a business from nothing was simply an echo of those early years watching my parents stretch every dollar, find joy in little victories, and never ever give up on each other. There was a stretch of time when Dad was laid off and things were tighter than usual. Instead of panicking, my parents sat me down and explained the situation. We made it a game to come up with ways to save money, turning off lights, making picnics, instead of eating out, learning to fix what we could, rather than replacing it. Looking back, I realized they weren't just surviving. They were teaching me how to face hardship with creativity and grit. Of course, there were moments when I rebelled. I wanted new shoes, a cooler backpack, permission to dye my hair blue. I'd roll my eyes when Mom insisted on family dinners, or Dad made me help alphabetize the bookshelves. But even then, there was a kind of safety in their consistency. I always knew where to find them, and maybe more importantly, I knew they'd be there no matter what mistakes I made. That sort of unconditional presence is rare, I've learned, and it planted a seed of self-worth in me that would later become the foundation for everything else. One afternoon stands out more than the rest. I was 13, and I'd just failed my first big math test. I was convinced it was the end of the world. Mom found me hiding in my room, fighting back tears, and instead of scolding me, she sat beside me and asked, "What do you think you could do differently next time?" It was a simple question, but it changed everything. She didn't care about the grade, she cared about the lesson. That night, Dad joined us at the kitchen table, and together we made a plan to get me through algebra. It wasn't about perfection, it was about perseverance. If you're listening to this and thinking your own childhood was nothing like mine, please know this family isn't always about blood or tradition. Sometimes it's the people who choose you again and again, even when you make things hard. Sometimes it's the neighbor who leaves soup on your doorstep, or the teacher who sees potential when everyone else looks away. For me, family was the soil where I first learned to grow. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep me reaching for more. As I grew older, I watched my parents face their own storms. There were fights, some loud, some silent. There were moments when love seemed like work, not magic. But even then, there was always forgiveness. Mom would sit out on the porch, staring at the sky, and later she'd come back in and say, "No storm lasts forever." I didn't realize how much I'd need that phrase years later when my own life seemed to split open. But at the time, it felt like a promise the world would always keep. There's one more thing about my childhood that shaped me maybe more than any single lesson or moment. My parents made space for my dreams, even the impossible ones. When I wanted to start a lemonade stand, they let me set up on the sidewalk even when I only made $5 the whole summer. When I said I wanted to study art instead of accounting, they saved what little they could to help with supplies. "The world needs more beauty," Dad would say, handing me a box of colored pencils. It didn't matter if my dreams changed every season, they always encouraged me to chase them. Now looking back, I see that these were the first bricks in the foundation of my independence. I learned early on that the world could be tough, but I could be tougher, and that the greatest thing you can do for someone you love is to believe in their possibility. It's a small lesson, but it changes everything. Sometimes the best thing you can give your child isn't money or comfort, but the confidence to stand back up when they fall. As you listen to this, maybe you're remembering your own beginnings, those small, imperfect moments that somehow shaped who you are today. For me, it all started in that kitchen with the smell of cinnamon and the sound of old records. I didn't know it then, but those quiet lessons would become my armor in the battles ahead. Because when love and hardship both live under one roof, you learn that survival isn't just about holding on, it's about letting yourself grow, even when the storm clouds gather. And so this is where my story truly begins, not in the boardroom or the courtroom, not at the height of success or the depth of betrayal, but in the gentle certainty that I was worth fighting for. That knowledge planted long ago would carry me through every challenge to come. Because before there was heartbreak, before there was courage, there was a little girl learning to trust her own light, no matter how dark the world became. As I step forward into the next chapter, falling in love, building my own dreams, believing in home again, I hope you'll walk with me. The storms may be waiting on the horizon, but the sun has always been there, just behind the clouds. Let's see where it takes us next. They say you never forget the moment your life quietly begins to change, even if at the time it just feels like a chance encounter. For me, it was one of those blustery spring afternoons in Monterey, the kind where the ocean mist hangs in the air and every storefront window reflects a little slice of your hope back at you. I was 24, working 2 part-time jobs while building my first online decor shop from scratch. My world was routines and long hours, not romance. But then Andrew Taylor walked into my favorite cafe, looking lost and a little windswept, and suddenly the quiet parts of my life seemed to shimmer with new possibility. Andrew was a newly graduated engineer with a lopsided grin, an easy sense of humor, and the sort of curiosity that made every conversation feel alive. We met by accident, literally. He spilled coffee on my sketchbook, mortified, and I found myself laughing for the first time in weeks. That became our first real conversation, sitting side by side as the sky outside turned from blue to a muted gray. He talked about bridges and bicycles. I told him about design and childhood books, and something clicked in that gentle, unhurried way the best beginnings often do. Our courtship was built on small, meaningful rituals. Andrew would wait for me outside the library after my evening shift sometimes, with a cup of hot chocolate, sometimes just with his quiet presence. We'd walk the length of Cannery Row, telling each other stories of who we'd been before this, his dreams of designing something that would last, my stubborn hope of building a business that mattered. There were picnics on the sand, stargazing on the cliffs, and long, silly debates over what color we'd paint our first apartment. Sometimes I think those were the happiest days of my life, not because they were perfect, but because they felt honest. It was the kind of love that made you feel seen, finally, by someone who didn't want you to be anyone but yourself. If you've ever been in love like that, you know how quickly hope can turn into plans. Before long, we were talking about the future in a way that made it seem not just possible, but inevitable. We shared notebooks full of ideas, houses we'd buy dogs, we'd adopt trips we'd take when we could finally afford it. I let myself imagine us as a team, the kind my parents had always been for each other, facing the world shoulder to shoulder. I thought in those early years that we were building something unbreakable. But looking back, I can see the little cracks that started to form even before we realized they mattered. Andrew's family, for one, was different from mine in all the ways I hadn't expected. His mother, Gloria, called often, her voice both warm and insistent, asking about our plans, our finances, our choices. At first, I found it endearing, her wanting to be involved to share her advice. I told myself it was just another form of love, one I could get used to. But sometimes after hanging up the phone, Andrew would seem smaller somehow, his shoulders tense, his confidence just a bit diminished. I'd reassure him, brush it off, and move on. Love, I thought, meant taking the good with the bad. There was one spring break when we went to visit his childhood home in Sacramento. Gloria fussed over us making elaborate dinners and telling old family stories, but I sensed an undercurrent, her need to be needed, her unwillingness to let Andrew become his own man. I saw the way she pressed him for details about our finances or gently questioned our decisions about work. I chalked it up to motherly worry, but Andrew withdrew a little after every visit, and I started to wonder if love sometimes meant choosing sides, even when you didn't want to. Still, we made it work. We moved in together in a tiny sunlit apartment overlooking the wharf, pinching pennies and dreaming big. Andrew landed a steady job as an engineer, and my business finally started turning a profit. There were setbacks, of course, late nights bills we weren't sure how to pay, moments when our dreams felt too far away to reach. But we were stubborn. We clung to each other in the storms, believing that what we had was worth protecting. Sometimes in the quiet of early morning, I'd catch Andrew staring out at the ocean worry lines etched on his face. I'd ask him what was wrong, and he'd always say, "Nothing I can't fix." It was a promise, one I wanted so badly to believe, even when the world got loud and the future felt uncertain. There's a certain magic in those early years when you think love alone will be enough to carry you through anything. The truth is, I carried a lot of expectations into our marriage, most of them shaped by the family I'd grown up in. I assumed that if you loved someone fiercely enough, the rest would sort itself out, that patience and partnership would smooth out any differences. But sometimes the lessons we learn at home aren't a blueprint, they're just a starting point. Andrew and I were two good people trying our best, but we didn't always see the world the same way. There were quiet disagreements about money, about whose dreams should come first, about how much of ourselves we owed to family, and how much we could safely keep for ourselves. Looking back, I wish I'd asked more questions about what Andrew wanted from life, about how he saw our future, about where he drew his own boundaries. I wish I'd noticed sooner how much he wanted to please everyone, not just me, and how that need could become its own kind of burden. But we were young and in love, and sure that together we could weather anything. If there's a lesson in those years, it's that love is only the beginning. It gives you hope, a vision, a partner to dream with, but it can't do all the work. Real partnership means seeing each other clearly, not just as you wish the other to be, but as they are flaws and fears and all. And it means knowing when to ask for help, when to draw lines, and when to speak up for the life you both deserve. Those were the years when I thought home was just a place you built with the person you loved. I didn't yet understand that home was also a feeling, a sense of being safe, respected, and supported for who you truly are. I would learn that lesson soon, but not in the way I hoped. As Andrew's job became more demanding, and my business pulled me in 100 different directions, we promised each other that nothing could pull us apart. We meant it. But sometimes life tests even the strongest promises, and the ones that survive aren't always the ones you expect. The next chapter of our story would bring new challenges, ones I never could have imagined on those gentle early days when love felt simple and the world seemed ours for the taking. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over a home when you first start living together, just two people finding their rhythms, building new routines out of small choices. For Andrew and me, those early married days in our sunlit apartment were a patchwork of quiet Sunday mornings, shared coffee, and the comfort of knowing even on the hard days that we were making something together. But as with all things, the peacefulness didn't last forever. Sometimes change doesn't come with a storm, but with a gentle knock at the door. The day Gloria arrived, it was almost an afterthought. She called in the middle of a rainy afternoon, her voice just a little too cheerful. "My lease is up," she said, "and I thought what better time to be closer to my son and to you, Madison." She spoke as if the decision had already been made, and before I could even process it, Andrew was offering to help her move, assuring her there was a guest room in the apartment complex right across the street. "It'll only be for a few months, just until she gets settled," he promised me that night. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be the kind of daughter-in-law who said yes and meant it. At first it was almost sweet. Gloria brought over homemade casseroles, hung new curtains in her space, and fussed over Andrew as if he were still a child. She had an energy that could fill a room, stories about her nursing days, recipes from her childhood in Oklahoma, gentle reminders about how things ought to be. I tried to see the good, her loyalty, her humor, the way she remembered everyone's birthday with a card and a smile. For a while, I told myself that all she wanted was to help. I smiled at her advice even when it didn't fit, and bit my tongue when she gently criticized how I folded the towels or seasoned the stew. But it wasn't long before little things started to change. Gloria would let herself into our apartment with the spare key Andrew had given her just in case, and I'd find her reorganizing the pantry or rearranging the living room furniture. If we went out for dinner, she'd call Andrew 3 times to ask if we were coming home soon, or if we could bring her dessert. It seemed harmless at first, but each request left me feeling a little less at home in my own space. I didn't know how to say no, so I didn't, hoping she'd eventually settle in and give us back our privacy. Finances soon became another front line. Gloria always seemed to have a reason for needing a little extra help, a doctor's bill, a new prescription, a much-needed spa day to recover from the move. Andrew, wanting to please her, would quietly transfer money or hand her his credit card for errands. I tried to talk to him about boundaries, about setting limits for our own sake. But Andrew would just shrug, looking tired, and say, "She just needs a little support. She's family." I felt a pang of guilt every time I pushed back, as if I were being selfish for wanting to protect what we were building. The real strain came when Gloria started involving herself in decisions that should have belonged to us alone. She'd show up at Andrew's worksite with lunch and stay for hours chatting with his coworkers, sometimes even criticizing his supervisors. She'd sit with me during client calls for my business, offering helpful suggestions on pricing or design, often contradicting my own instincts. One time, she offered to help me organize my bookkeeping, only to leave my invoices in chaos. It was as if every part of our lives was slowly becoming hers. There's a subtle art to boundary setting, and I was failing at it spectacularly. Every time I tried to say something, I worried about hurting Andrew or driving a wedge between him and his mother. He'd grown up with Gloria as his only parent after his father passed away young. Their bond ran deep, a mix of loyalty and old habits I didn't fully understand. I didn't want to be the one to break it. So I stayed quiet, doing my best to adapt, telling myself this was just what marriage meant, loving not just your partner but all the family that came with them. Yet the more I accommodated, the more Gloria expected. There was the time she asked for help with a new car payment, suggesting that since my business was doing so well, it wouldn't hurt to pitch in. Or the day she handed me a list of repairs for her apartment, complete with estimates, and a cheery, "I knew you'd know how to get a good deal, Maddie." Each ask became a test, and each time I said yes, I felt the line between generosity and obligation blur a little more. It wasn't all conflict. There were moments of real kindness, too. Gloria could be charming, especially in public. She'd invite us to her book club, bring gifts for neighbors, even help out when a friend of mine had surgery. But behind closed doors, her expectations kept growing. Sometimes when I said no, she'd sulk for days, making Andrew miserable, until he apologized for both of us. Other times, she'd try to guilt me with stories of sacrifice, how hard she'd worked, how lonely she'd been before moving close to us, how grateful we should be for family sticking together. It was a tangled web, and I got lost in it more than once. If I learned anything during those months, it was that kindness without boundaries quickly turns to resentment. I tried to remind myself of the lessons from my own parents about saying no with love, about protecting what matters. But putting those lessons into practice, especially when it meant standing up to family, was far harder than I'd ever imagined. I watched myself slip further away from the easy confidence I'd always had, and I missed the feeling of being at home in my own life. One evening, after Gloria had borrowed my car without asking for the third time that week, I broke down to my best friend Lila. She listened quietly, then said something I'll never forget. "You're allowed to need space, Maddie, even from people who mean well." It was a simple truth, but it cut through the guilt and confusion like sunlight through fog. I started to see that loving someone didn't mean letting them take over every part of your world. That lesson about the necessity of boundaries became my anchor as things got harder. I realized that sometimes the greatest act of love for both yourself and the people around you is knowing when to say enough. It's not unkind to want a room of your own, a budget that's fair, or decisions that belong to you and your partner. It's just part of being whole. Looking back, I wish I'd found my voice sooner, but I know now that every boundary I failed to set was also a lesson learned. As Gloria's influence grew and Andrew struggled to find his footing, I sensed a shift coming, something bigger than a misplaced towel or a borrowed car. The lines between our lives were blurring, and I was starting to lose sight of where I ended and everyone else began. And so, with that gentle storm still gathering, I found myself standing on the edge of a new and unfamiliar season. The next part of our story would test more than my patience. It would challenge everything I thought I knew about loyalty, family, and the cost of saying yes when your heart needs to say no. Some breaking points arrive quietly, a gradual erosion you barely notice until there's nothing left to hold on to. Others arrive like a tidal wave, sudden, shocking, impossible to ignore. I used to believe that if you loved hard enough, worked long enough, and gave generously enough, you could hold a family together through any storm. But every foundation has its fault lines, and that winter mine finally began to crack. It started with small things, as it so often does. Gloria's requests became demands. She wanted a new laptop for her health records, then hinted that a weekend getaway with her old friends would do wonders for her spirits. Could we help with the cost? I just landed a major wholesale contract for my decor business and was carefully reinvesting every penny to keep our dream afloat, but guilt always found its way in. Andrew, for his part, had been laid off from his engineering firm months earlier and was spiraling, sleeping in, applying for jobs, half-heartedly telling himself and me that something would come up soon. Money became a shadow in every corner of our apartment. Andrew insisted on covering Gloria's rent just for a while, promising to pay me back as soon as he found steady work. I watched our savings drain one small transaction at a time and tried to bury my anxiety. At first, I believed this was what partnership meant, stepping up when your loved ones needed you. But as the months dragged on, resentment grew in the places where gratitude used to live. There were days when I barely recognized myself. I'd sit at the kitchen table with my laptop numbers blurring on the screen, wondering how long I could keep pretending everything was fine. Gloria's visits became more intrusive. She'd show up unannounced, rearrange my office, critique my spending, then suggest I was too controlling when I asked for space. Andrew grew defensive, snapping at me for making a big deal out of nothing. It felt as if the walls of our home were closing in the very place that once promised safety and partnership, now echoing with arguments and unspoken fears. One Saturday after another, long week of late-night work and mounting bills, the tension finally boiled over. Gloria arrived with the list of essentials she needed for her upcoming trip: a suitcase, new shoes, salon appointment, and maybe a little extra for souvenirs, Maddie dear. I felt my patience snap. "I'm sorry, Gloria, but we can't afford that right now," I said, keeping my voice steady. She stared at me surprised, then looked to Andrew for backup. He fidgeted, avoiding my gaze before mumbling, "Maybe we can make it work." That was the moment something shifted inside me. For the first time, I realized I was alone in a room full of people. The days that followed were a blur of arguments and icy silences. Gloria took offense at my refusal, calling me ungrateful, even hinting that I was trying to drive a wedge between her and her son. Andrew shut down, disappearing into late-night walks or hours in front of the TV. At dinner, no one spoke. At night, I lay awake, haunted by the sound of my own heartbeat, wondering how love had turned into something so heavy. The breaking point itself came not with shouting, but with a painful, quiet clarity. Gloria arrived unannounced one afternoon while I was on a call with a client. She stormed into my office, waving a bill I hadn't seen before, a boutique charge for hundreds of dollars, all in my name. "You can afford it," she said, "after everything I've done for this family." When I protested, she accused me of being selfish and cold, reminding me of all the time she'd made things easier for us, all the sacrifices she'd made for Andrew. I wish I could say I stood up for myself in that moment. But the truth is, I froze. I looked to Andrew for help, but he was silent, eyes glued to the floor, unwilling to intervene. That silence spoke louder than any argument. I realized I was no longer fighting just for our marriage, but for my own self-respect. I knew deep down that if I didn't draw the line here, I'd lose myself completely. Later that night, after Gloria left and Andrew disappeared for another long walk, I sat in the dark, replaying every conversation, every compromise, every apology I'd offered just to keep the peace. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed home was a place where you were safe, where love was a shelter and not a transaction. When had I stopped believing I deserved that? When did I start confusing giving with sacrificing my own well-being? The lesson I learned in those dark, lonely hours was a hard one. Sometimes loving others means first loving yourself enough to say enough. I thought back to the advice my mother once gave me after a childhood fight with a friend. "You can't pour from an empty cup, Madison, no matter how much you care." I realized I was trying to fill everyone else up while letting myself run dry. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called my parents, my voice trembling but determined. I told them the truth, not just about Gloria's demands or Andrew's silence, but about how lost I felt in my own life. They listened gently and invited me home for a weekend to rest and regroup. Packing a small bag felt like admitting defeat, but it was also a quiet act of hope. I needed space to remember who I was and what I was willing and unwilling to accept. Leaving wasn't easy. Gloria was furious, Andrew confused and wounded. but I knew that staying without boundaries would only make things worse for everyone. That drive down the foggy coastline to Pacific Grove was filled with doubt, but also with a sense of relief I hadn't felt in months. I didn't know what would come next, or if my marriage could be salvaged, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was choosing myself. If you've ever been in a place where love and obligation get tangled up, you know how hard it is to break free. We're taught to keep giving, to be patient, to hope for change. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go of old expectations of toxic patterns, of the idea that your worth is measured only by what you give. The first step to healing, I learned, is finding the courage to walk away from what hurts you, even if it means stepping into the unknown. And so with a heart full of fear and a flicker of hope, I returned to the place where I first learned what real love looked like. I didn't know what waited for me at home, but I knew I had to find my way back to myself one small step at a time. There's something quietly reassuring about coming home even when you're an adult with bruises the world can't see. I pulled up to my parents' house in Pacific Grove just as the fog was rolling in off the ocean, painting everything in gentle shades of gray and blue. The garden was overgrown, but the porch light was on, always somehow waiting for me. My mother opened the door before I even made it to the steps, her eyes full of worry and love. "You don't have to say anything yet," she whispered, pulling me into a hug. "Just let yourself rest." The first night back, I slept in my childhood bed, cocooned by the faded quilt Mom had made when I was 10. For the first time in months, I didn't wake up anxious. I listened to the house settle around me, the old heater clicking on the wind, tapping at the window, the sound of my father shuffling through the morning paper. Everything felt smaller and safer than I remembered, as if the world had shrunk down to the four walls that had always sheltered me best. I realized how much I'd been carrying, how the weight of someone else's expectations had slowly bent my back, and how light I felt finally to set it all down. My parents didn't ask for explanations, not at first. They simply let me be. My mother brewed chamomile tea and left little notes on my bedside table, reminders that I was loved, that healing wasn't a race. My father offered quiet companionship. He'd sit with me on the porch in the evenings, watching the fog drift in from the bay, not pressing for answers, just giving me space to breathe. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all. Sometimes I found myself spilling pieces of the story, bit by bit, like stones I'd been carrying for far too long. One afternoon, as I helped Mom knead dough for cinnamon bread, she finally asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Do you feel like yourself again, sweetheart?" I paused, flour dusting my hands, and admitted, "I don't know. I think I forgot who that was for a while." She nodded, her eyes shining with both sadness and pride. "That's okay. Sometimes you have to lose yourself to figure out what you can't live without." It was a simple truth, but it settled over me like a balm. I realized I'd spent so much time trying to hold everyone else together, I'd forgotten the soft places in my own soul. That week, I did small things to feel whole again. I walked the old neighborhood trails I'd loved as a teenager, letting the salt air clear my mind. I dug out my childhood sketchbooks, filling empty pages with new designs and ideas for my business, reminding myself that I was still creative, still capable, still me, even after everything that had happened. Sometimes the simplest rituals are the ones that bring you back to life. I watched the sunset from the cliffs with my father, just as we used to, and let the world feel big and full of promise again. It wasn't just comfort that my parents offered, it was perspective. My father told me about his own struggles in early marriage, the times when he and Mom had nearly given up, and how forgiveness and boundaries had saved them both. My mother shared stories of women she'd known, friends, neighbors who'd weathered storms in their own families, each one learning the hard way that love and sacrifice can't exist without respect. I realized that what I was experiencing wasn't unique. It was part of a bigger pattern, a lesson many women learn when they dare to want more from their lives than just endurance. One evening, my best friend Lila drove down from the city to see me. She brought chocolate and movies, but mostly she brought laughter, the kind that bubbles up from old memories and makes you believe in second chances. We sat in the backyard wrapped in blankets, talking about everything and nothing. She reminded me that I'd built my business from nothing, that I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. "Don't let this be the end of your story, Maddie," she said, squeezing my hand. "Let it be the start of something you choose for yourself." In those gentle days of recovery, I began to dream again, not just about survival, but about possibility. I made a list of what I wanted, not just in marriage, but in every part of my life. I wanted partnership, respect, laughter, and the freedom to build something beautiful. I wanted to feel at home in my own skin, and to never apologize for drawing boundaries that protected my heart. It was the first time in years I'd allowed myself to name what I needed, and it felt like reclaiming a part of myself I thought I'd lost. If there's a lesson in that quiet return home, it's this: you don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love and rest. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders to prove your value. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step away from the noise, find a place that reminds you who you are, and let yourself begin again. We all need a sanctuary, whether it's a childhood home, a circle of friends, or simply the quiet conviction that you deserve better. As the days passed, my energy returned. I started to see the future not as a burden, but as an open field one I could walk across at my own pace. I checked in on my business, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of orders and emails, knowing that my hard work had given me a safety net even now. My parents encouraged me to think clearly and act deliberately, reminding me that I had options, that the next chapter didn't have to look like the last. When I was finally ready, I sat down with both of them and shared everything, every hurt, every hope, every plan for what would come next. They listened, unwavering their love, a gentle anchor in the storm. "Whatever you decide, Maddie, you won't be alone," my father said quietly, and for the first time I believed him. I wasn't alone. I never had been. So with my strength renewed and my heart steadier than it had been in months, I began to think about what it would take to truly move forward, not just to escape what had hurt me, but to build a life defined by my own choices. I knew that soon I'd have to face Andrew and Gloria again. But this time, I would do it on my terms, guided by the lessons learned in the gentle embrace of home. Clarity has a way of arriving when you're finally still enough to listen. In the calm of my parents' home, I realized that rest is not the same as running away. It's a pause, a breath, before you choose the next step. Once the aches of exhaustion faded, I found something waiting beneath the hurt determination. I knew at last that going back to my old life without change would only lead me to the same crossroads again. I needed a plan, and more than that, I needed the courage to see it through. I started small with what I could control. My mother sat beside me at the dining table as I pulled up bank statements on my laptop, scrolling through months of transactions. Money spent on Gloria's behalf, loan payments, checks written from my business account just to help. For the first time, I saw the pattern clearly, not generosity, but a slow bleed of my hard work. It was a hard truth to face, but necessary. I printed every statement, highlighted every expense, and built a file thicker than I expected. It felt less like accusing and more like drawing a map out of the forest I'd gotten lost in. The next step was scarier, finding a legal ally. My best friend Lila recommended Samantha Brooks, a former classmate who'd built a reputation for fiercely advocating for women in tough situations. The idea of sharing my private pain with a stranger unnerved me, but Samantha made it easier. She listened, patient and steady, never judging, only asking the questions I'd been too afraid to consider. "What do you want? What would a fair outcome look like for you?" She explained my rights, how California law treated shared assets, what counted as marital property, the difference between a gift and an obligation. Her knowledge was a lifeline, her confidence a gentle reminder that I didn't have to do this alone. As we met over coffee in a quiet downtown cafe, Samantha guided me through the first Real Steps document, everything: keep records of communication, gather proof of payments and requests. She explained that the courts wouldn't just look at my words, they'd look for evidence. I began saving texts and emails from Gloria, notes about conversations with Andrew, and receipts for every dollar spent. With each document, I felt a little less powerless, a little more like the capable woman I'd been before. Sometimes I caught myself doubting, was I overreacting? Wasn't this just what family did for each other? Samantha was gentle but firm. There's a difference between support and sacrifice that drains you. Boundaries are not punishments. They're the shape of a healthy life. That line stuck with me. It reminded me that drawing a line in the sand isn't about shutting people out, but about protecting what matters most: yourself, your dreams, your peace. I shared all of this with my parents. They supported me every step, offering not advice, but encouragement to trust my instincts. My father told me about a time early in his career when he'd had to fight for fair treatment at work. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't standing up to others, it's convincing yourself that you deserve to, he said, and I saw a little of myself in his story. My mother reminded me that kindness can coexist with strength. You can be gentle with others and still be firm with your boundaries, she said as she folded laundry beside me. As I organized my files and read through the laws, I thought about all the other women who had quietly accepted less than they deserved, who had stayed silent for fear of rocking the boat. I read articles, watched interviews, and even joined an online support group for women navigating similar situations. Their stories were heartbreakingly familiar: women who'd loaned money to relatives, who'd been guilted into supporting in-laws, who'd felt too ashamed to speak up until the weight became too much. The pattern was clear, and the lesson even clearer: silence only ever benefits those who take advantage. One day Samantha called with an update. "You have a strong case, Madison. The law is on your side, but you need to be ready for pushback from Andrew, from Gloria, maybe even from people who don't understand." Her words settled over me like a challenge. I'd spent so long avoiding conflict, smoothing over rough edges, trying to make everyone else comfortable. Now I had to learn a new skill: standing firm, even when it made others uncomfortable. I began practicing what I'd say. I wrote down boundaries. I needed no more financial support for Gloria, full transparency in shared accounts, the right to make decisions about my own business. I even rehearsed conversations with Andrew, imagining every reaction from anger to denial to guilt. It was emotionally exhausting, but also liberating. Each step forward was a small reclamation of the self I'd let slip away. I also made time for self-care, remembering that resilience isn't just about fighting hard battles, but about tending to your own heart. I hiked the bluffs above the bay, letting the wind remind me of my own strength. I treated myself to a new set of paints and lost hours filling canvas after canvas with color, each one a reminder that creation and hope can bloom even in hard seasons. I learned slowly that healing isn't just the absence of pain, but the presence of something new: confidence, clarity, courage. The lesson in this chapter wasn't just about legal rights or financial protection. It was about honoring the work I'd done, the business I'd built, the dreams I'd carried, the boundaries I was learning to draw. It was about accepting help not as weakness, but as wisdom. It was about giving myself permission to want more and to fight for it. As the file of evidence grew, so did my resolve. I knew that soon I'd have to return to Monterey and face Andrew and Gloria, not as the exhausted, uncertain woman who'd left, but as someone ready to defend her future. I would go back not to accept the old terms, but to rewrite the rules, to claim what was rightfully mine, and to insist gently but without apology that my life would be shaped by my own hands. With every step I felt the fear ease and the hope rise. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew I wouldn't be facing it alone. My parents, my friends, and Samantha would be behind me. Most importantly, I would be standing with myself. And so, with new documents in hand and a stronger heart than I'd known in years, I prepared for the confrontation to come. It was time to return, not just to a house, but to my own sense of worth, ready to negotiate from a place of strength. Whatever came next, I knew I was no longer just surviving. I was reclaiming my future, one brave decision at a time. There's a special kind of courage that comes not with fanfare or shouting, but with the quiet resolve to do what's right for yourself. When I pulled back into Monterey after weeks away, the familiar salt air felt both like a memory and a challenge. I drove past the wharf, the little cafes I once loved, and into the neighborhood where my life had become so tangled. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, but inside, I knew I was different. This time I was coming back not to bend, but to stand up straight. Andrew met me at the door with a nervous smile, relief flickering in his eyes. "I'm glad you're back, Maddie," he said, reaching for my hand. The apartment felt almost unchanged, but the air between us was heavier. Gloria's perfume lingered in the hallway. There was a part of me that wanted to soften, wanted to fall back into old habits and keep the peace. But I remembered Samantha's words, my parents' stories, and the countless women whose voices had carried me through the darkest nights. I wasn't here to play the same role. I was here to write a new script. That afternoon, we sat around the kitchen table, me, Andrew, and Gloria, each of us holding on to our own kind of hope. Gloria was the first to speak, her voice smooth and practiced. "We're all family," she began. "We've had some misunderstandings. Let's clear the air." There was a practiced warmth in her tone, but also an edge. I listened, letting her finish, then carefully laid out the boundaries I'd written in my notebook. No more unannounced visits. No more financial support. Respect for my work, my space, my choices. Andrew shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Can't we just work this out? We're all under stress. Maybe we can compromise." I shook my head gently. "Compromise is a two-way street, Andrew. I've given and given until there's nothing left of me. I need things to change, not just promises, real change." I slid the folder of bank statements across the table, my heart racing. This isn't about resentment. It's about fairness and respect. Gloria's face tightened. For the first time, she looked genuinely surprised. She tried to laugh it off to make it seem like I was being dramatic, but I didn't waver. "It's not dramatic to expect honesty or to protect what I've built," I said quietly. "It's not unkind to say no." Andrew looked between us, searching for his usual place as the peacekeeper, but the old balance was gone. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the desire to please everyone, even as the cost became clear. Negotiating with family is unlike anything else. Every word feels loaded, every silence heavy. I remembered Samantha's advice: stay factual, stay firm, don't get pulled into guilt or emotional traps. I explained calmly that I was no longer willing to shoulder responsibilities that weren't mine. That meant ending Gloria's access to our accounts, setting strict limits on help, and making sure every agreement was in writing. It also meant Andrew would need to be transparent about his own finances and seek work with a seriousness that matched the urgency of our situation. It wasn't easy. Gloria argued, pleaded, and finally accused me of not caring. "I moved here for you too," she cried. "I gave up everything." There was pain in her words, but also an old pattern of manipulation I now saw for what it was. "You're right," I said gently. "You have sacrificed. But so have I. And I can't lose myself to make anyone else happy." Andrew started to apologize for her, but I stopped him. This isn't about taking sides. It's about finding a way forward that honors everyone, but doesn't erase me. We spent hours at that table. There were tears, silences, and moments when I wondered if I was asking too much. But with each point, I held the burden on my chest, lessened. I shared copies of everything with Samantha, and she offered quiet encouragement from afar, reviewing proposals, rewriting agreements, making sure I had legal protection as we redrew the boundaries of our life. For the first time, I felt like I was negotiating as an equal, not a bystander in my own home. There were practical victories and small setbacks. Gloria agreed grudgingly to find her own place within 6 months. Andrew promised to focus on job hunting, to respect my business boundaries, and to work with me on a new financial plan. We set up joint calendars, shared passwords, and created a written agreement for all future family support. It wasn't a magical fix, but it was a start, a clear line between generosity and sacrifice. I learned in that season that real power comes from clarity. When you know what you need, you can ask for it. When you know what you deserve, you're less likely to accept less. I realized that my compassion wasn't a weakness, it was a strength, as long as I honored it in myself as much as in others. There were moments when Andrew looked at me with something like fear, but also I hoped with a growing respect. I could no longer be the person who made herself small for the sake of harmony. Harmony, after all, requires more than one voice. That week, I found myself walking along the shore at dusk, the sky wide and blue over the water. I felt the edges of myself coming back like a song I hadn't heard in years. the lesson was simple but profound. You can love your family and still expect respect. You can offer support, but not at the cost of your own foundation. Boundaries, I finally understood, are the lines that let love survive without turning into resentment. As I looked toward the future, I knew there would be more challenges. Patterns don't break in a day. But I felt ready, more ready than ever before, to protect my peace, to nurture my dreams, and to insist on a life built on shared respect, not silent endurance. The next part of my journey would test these boundaries. Sometimes when people lose control, they fight even harder to regain it. I could sense a storm still brewing behind Gloria's polite smiles and Andrew's uneasy promises. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I'd learned to hold my ground, and no matter what came next, I would meet it with the same quiet courage that had brought me home to myself. It's easy to imagine that drawing boundaries ends the story, that once you've found your voice and made yourself clear, the world will settle into order. But the truth is, for every line you draw, there's often someone willing to test it. In the weeks that followed our kitchen table negotiations, I learned that real change doesn't always arrive with relief. Sometimes it arrives as a storm, one last surge of old habits fighting to reclaim their ground. At first there was quiet. Gloria kept her distance, busying herself with apartment listings and bridge club invitations. Andrew, too, seemed to try. He got up early, sent out resumes, even helped around the house. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe we'd turned a corner, maybe respect really could replace resentment. But old patterns rarely disappear without protest, and soon enough the cracks began to show. It started small with Gloria's familiar tactics. She'd stop by unexpectedly just to drop off some soup or see how you two are holding up. Each visit brought subtle digs, comments about how empty her new place felt, how she missed family dinners, how she hoped none of this unpleasantness would last. I tried to be polite but firm, thanking her for the soup but reminding her to call ahead next time. Sometimes she'd smile and nod, but the glint in her eyes said she hadn't forgotten what she wanted. Andrew, meanwhile, began to struggle with the changes. He said all the right things when I asked about job leads or our financial plan, but his enthusiasm faded quickly. I caught him late one night, scrolling through old photos of his childhood, tears in his eyes. I just wish things could go back to how they were, he confessed. It was hard not to reach for him to soothe his sadness. But I knew the only way forward was through honesty, not comfort born of denial. "We can't go back, Andrew," I whispered. "We can only make better choices now." As pressure mounted, Gloria's approach changed from subtle guilt to open challenge. She began calling Andrew late at night, her voice tight with frustration. One morning, I overheard them arguing on the phone. "She's tearing this family apart." Gloria said, her words sharp as knives. "She cares more about money than blood." "Is that the woman you married?" Andrew mumbled a weak defense, but I could hear his confidence faltering. Later, he turned that pain on me. "Why can't you just be flexible, Maddie? She's my mother." It was the oldest argument in the world, and I felt my resolve waver. I started to doubt myself, wondering if I'd gone too far. Was I really asking too much? Had I traded compassion for stubbornness? But then I'd remember the years spent bending and yielding, how each yes had taken something from me, how each silent compromise had made me smaller. I clung to the truth I'd fought so hard to see: you cannot build love on the foundation of self-erasure. Things escalated when Gloria showed up one afternoon, suitcase in hand, claiming she'd been locked out of her new apartment by a misunderstanding with the landlord. She expected without asking to move back in just until things get sorted. I knew it was a test. My heart hammered in my chest, but I stood by my new boundaries. "I'm sorry, Gloria, but that's not possible. I can help you find a hotel for a few days if you need." Her face hardened. "I knew it would come to this. Blood means nothing to you." She left in a fury, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Andrew was furious, but underneath his anger I saw fear, a man torn between the old loyalties and a new reality. "How could you turn her away?" he demanded. I wanted to yell, to list every way I'd been the one making sacrifices, but instead, I spoke softly. "This isn't about not loving your mother. It's about loving myself enough to ask for respect." He didn't answer. For the first time, he slept on the couch. The days that followed were heavy with silence and unease. Gloria sent emails, texts, even tried to rally family members to her side. Rumors began to circle stories about how I'd changed, how I'd let success go to my head. I tried to hold steady, reminding myself that truth does not depend on consensus. I leaned on my parents and Samantha, who reminded me that pushback is a sign you're shifting a dysfunctional system, not a signal to retreat. One morning, Lila came to visit, bringing flowers in her usual candor. "You're doing the right thing," she told me, holding my hand tight. "Change is messy, but you're protecting more than just yourself. You're teaching everyone around you that boundaries matter." Her words steadied me. I realized that this wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about modeling a new way of loving and living. Sometimes the hardest part of growth is weathering the storm of those who fear they're losing control. If there's a lesson in that turbulent season, it's this: every step toward self-respect may cost you comfort, but it buys you back your freedom. Old patterns will fight to survive. The guilt trips the rumors, the tears. They are the last defenses of a system built on silence and self-sacrifice. The only way out is through standing firm, weathering the backlash, and refusing to be shamed back into the person you were. As the weeks passed, the noise began to fade. Gloria found another apartment, one further away but cheaper, and surrounded by people she could charm into new friendships. Andrew and I, bruised but still standing, faced a crossroads. I saw in his eyes a growing understanding, maybe even respect. But I also knew that some rifts, once exposed to the light, cannot be hidden again. With the worst of the storm behind me, I began to see what was possible. I was tired, yes, but stronger than I'd ever been. The price of change was high, but the reward, my own peace, my own voice, was beyond measure. And so, as spring crept back into Monterey and the ocean air lost its chill, I prepared for the next challenge, the courtroom, where I would fight for more than just assets or closure. I would fight for the right to shape my life on my own terms, no matter who tried to rewrite my story. The courthouse in Monterey sits just a few blocks from the water, its windows forever fogged by the marine air. I'd passed it 100 times, never imagining I'd one day be stepping inside as the protagonist of my own case. The morning of the hearing, I woke early, my stomach fluttering with both dread and relief. I watched the sky brighten from behind the curtains of my childhood room, feeling the weight of every step that had led me here. My parents drove me, their presence grounding me in a way I desperately needed. Samantha, my lawyer, met us on the steps, calm and collected as always. She handed me a folder of carefully organized evidence bank statements, texts from Gloria, copies of emails, a timeline of events. I clung to the papers like a lifeline. "You're ready, Madison," she whispered. "This is just another room. You've already done the hardest work." Inside, the halls were quiet, echoing with the shuffle of nervous feet and the hum of vending machines. Andrew sat on a bench outside the courtroom, eyes fixed on the tile floor. Gloria was beside him, composed, but tense lips pressed into a line. There was a time I would have shrunk beneath her glare, but now I met her eyes without flinching. I realized in that moment that the fear I'd carried for so long was smaller than the truth I was finally ready to share. When the judge called us in, my heart beat so loudly, I thought everyone must hear it. Samantha took charge, her questions clear, her tone measured. She walked the judge through the details, the pattern of financial demands, the gradual erosion of my savings, the emotional toll of years spent balancing generosity and self-sacrifice. I spoke when prompted, steadying my hands on the table, my voice trembling only once when I described the day I finally left. Gloria's lawyer tried to paint a different picture. She talked about family obligation, about how Gloria had given everything to help us succeed, how my business was thriving thanks to her encouragement. There were moments when I almost doubted myself, when the old guilt nipped at my resolve. But each time I remembered the quiet strength my parents had shown me, the gentle certainty of Samantha's hand on my shoulder. I spoke the truth over and over, until it no longer felt like a confession, but a declaration I am allowed to draw boundaries. I am allowed to protect my work, my peace, my future. Andrew spoke too. He admitted his struggles, his loyalty to his mother, the confusion and guilt that had left him frozen. It was hard to listen without bitterness, but I tried. I wanted closure, not vengeance. The judge asked thoughtful questions, patient but firm, sifting through evidence and emotion to find the shape of fairness. Hours passed in a blur of testimony and paperwork. I watched sunlight crawl across the courtroom wall and thought about all the women who had sat in rooms like this fighting for the right to be heard. I wasn't just here for myself anymore. I was part of something larger, a slow shift toward justice that happened one voice, one document, one brave moment at a time. At last, the judge delivered her decision. Her words were clear, compassionate, and final. This court recognizes Madison's contributions, her right to financial independence, and the necessity of boundaries for healthy relationships. The marital assets will be divided fairly with no further obligations for support beyond what is legally required. Gloria will vacate any shared property, and both parties are encouraged to pursue healing, not hostility, moving forward. Relief hit me like a wave. I didn't win everything, but I'd kept what mattered: my work, my dignity, and the freedom to write a new chapter. Afterward, I found myself outside, blinking in the bright sun, the wind off the ocean, feeling like the first clean breath I'd taken in years. Samantha hugged me, her professional armor softening to a genuine smile. "You did it, Madison. You didn't just survive, you changed the rules." My parents hugged me tight, pride shining in their eyes. I let the victory settle slowly, feeling not triumphant, but quietly, deeply whole. The days that followed felt surreal. Andrew moved into a small apartment across town, and Gloria, after one final barrage of angry emails, faded from my daily life. There were moments of grief, mourning what might have been letting go of the old dream of a family healed by patience alone. But there was also a widening sense of hope. I poured my energy into my business, reaching out to friends I'd neglected, rediscovering the simple pleasure of mornings spent in the sunlit kitchen, the world suddenly wide again. If there's a lesson in that courtroom battle, it's that justice is rarely about dramatic victories. It's about showing up for yourself, about gathering the pieces of your life and saying, "I am worthy of peace." The process was draining, often overwhelming, but every step I took was a step away from silence and resentment and a step toward something better. I thought back to the little girl in her parents' kitchen, learning to make cinnamon bread, watching her mother move through the world with grace and conviction. I carried that legacy into every hard conversation, every signature on every page. Sometimes healing looks like an ending, but more often it's the quiet work of believing in your own right to begin again. And as the next season unfolded, I felt something unexpected: gratitude. Not for the struggle itself, but for the strength it revealed in me, the steady, gentle courage that grows from knowing finally that you can choose your own life. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Spring came to Monterey with soft breezes and sunlight that filtered through every window in my little home. It was the kind of season that makes you believe in renewal, the slow, persistent work of green shoots pushing through earth once battered by storms. Sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and the hum of my business, humming quietly from the next room, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. The journey hadn't been simple. It was stitched together from late-night doubts, small victories, and the gentle guidance of those who loved me most. When I think back to those early days, the cinnamon bread, the porch light always left on, I realize now that everything I needed to survive the hardest chapters was planted long before the trouble ever began. The warmth of my parents, the confidence they fostered, the belief that you could always come home again. These were the tools that let me stand my ground, even when my voice shook. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this: our roots matter, but so does the way we learn to grow beyond them. My love story with Andrew started with hope, laughter, and a shared dream. We built a life together, believing that love alone could weather any storm. But life, as it turns out, demands more than just hope. It asks for honesty, courage, and the willingness to change when old patterns begin to hurt. Gloria's arrival tested every limit I thought I had. I learned that love without boundaries can slowly become obligation, and that saying enough is not just brave, but necessary. For every viewer who struggled with loyalty and guilt, know this: your kindness doesn't mean you owe anyone your peace. There were moments in the heart of conflict when I doubted everything. When Gloria's demands grew louder, when Andrew's silence felt like betrayal, when the cost of standing up for myself seemed almost too high. But through each challenge, I discovered something I'd forgotten: you do not have to disappear to keep the peace. True harmony is built with honesty, sometimes painful, sometimes uncomfortable, but always rooted in respect. I made mistakes. I bent too far too often. Yet each step back toward myself was a lesson in compassion, both for others and for the little girl I used to be. Returning to my parents' home was not a defeat, but a return to wisdom. Their quiet support, the gentle stories of their own struggles, reminded me that every generation learns and relearns the boundaries of love. I rebuilt my strength piece by piece, surrounded by the people who saw me not as a caretaker or a provider, but as a daughter, worthy of rest, deserving of joy. Sometimes it takes stepping away to truly see your life and to remember that healing is as much about rest as it is about action. Taking legal action was frightening, but it was also a declaration my work, my dreams, and my well-being were not negotiable. In the courtroom, I fought for more than just assets. I fought for my right to set limits, to be seen and heard. The judge's decision didn't just return my freedom. It affirmed what I'd always sensed: that justice is built quietly on the courage to speak up. The relief I felt was not just for myself, but for every person who has ever wondered if they're asking for too much when they demand to be treated with respect. Today I wake each morning in a space that is truly my own. I nurture my business, surround myself with friends who bring laughter, and keep my boundaries as a daily act of self-love. There are moments of loneliness, yes, but also a wide, bright hope for what's still ahead. Andrew and I are both finding our own ways now, and Gloria has found new connections. I wish them well from afar, grateful for the lessons we learned together, lessons about limits, forgiveness, and the true shape of family. If you see yourself anywhere in this story, if you've ever felt small in a place that should feel safe, or if you're standing at your own crossroads, I hope you'll take this to heart. You are worthy of love that doesn't cost your soul. You are allowed to ask for more, to change, to begin again. And you are never ever alone. We all stumble. We all start over. The bravest thing you can do is keep moving forward even when the path is uncertain. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. Your presence, your attention, and your willingness to listen mean more than you know. If my story has resonated, inspired, or comforted you, I invite you to join our community here. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share your own experiences or thoughts in the comments below. Every story matters, especially yours. Let's keep building a space where honesty is welcome, healing is possible, and no one has to walk through life's hardest lessons alone. Until next time, take gentle care and remember your next chapter is yours to write.